Okay, you guys, this is a video and a subject that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, and that subject is going to be cryptozoology. I just wanted to look through some cryptids and kind of make a tier ranking based on which cryptids I think are more realistic of existing to cryptids I think which are essentially impossible to exist unless if they're somehow supernatural. I think a big problem with cryptozoology in the way that that it's being put forward is that it has one foot in pseudoscience and one foot in real science. And the proponents of cryptozoology, or the modern proponents of cryptozoology, are almost always pseudoscientists. The problem is that you could easily have a scientific cryptozoology if you're looking after certain animals, which indeed on this list I believe are quite likely to exist, or some that are somewhat likely. But cryptozoology attempts to always force animals of folklore, of legend, of urban legend, which could be supernatural, which would make more sense if they are supernatural, in an attempt to find a biological or a material explanation for them. And that's why it always ends up being pseudoscience for the most part. So, cryptozoologists are always focusing on species which aren't very likely. So, say something like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, rather than something that could be somewhat likely, say, finding a relic population of mammoths or finding alien big cats. Some of them go after alien big cats, and I'm going to talk about it. Generally, I would put the ABCs or alien big cats as the highest most likely cryptid that is popular. But they don't go after, like the mooses in New Zealand, right? They don't go after phantom kangaroos. They always go after something which is really romantic. Supercabra or the Mongolian deathworm. They really like romantic monsters of folklore as opposed to animals which could very reasonably exist. I think that animals which would be an undiscovered taxon are extremely unlikely, and the higher you go on on the list of taxonomy, so like an undiscovered species, somewhat likely, right? But where you're going into undiscovered genus, family, order, class, and finally phylum, you're talking about things which are astronomically unlikely. But when cryptozoology is following around vagrant animals, animals that are hidden, that are appearing in one area of the world where they shouldn't be, that's way, way likely. Or you're going after relic animals or hidden invasive species. Those are very, very likely in that there should be expeditions to look and categorize those animals. Or recently extinct animals which are being cited. And those are just all very likely. Another problem with cryptozoology is always going after megafauna, right? They're not going after less romantic things like finding new species of frogs, which is much more likely. They always want to find, megafauna, and especially something like carnivorous megafauna or ape men folklore, which means that what they're looking for makes it less likely. But what should be said is that there have been a fair amount of megafauna which have been discovered in the modern era. If you go into Southeast Asia, into Indochina, there's the Saloa and the big Monjak. Those are two critically endangered, and I think at one time were cryptozoological species of deer that were found in the 1990s. And then there's always, deep sea stuff they're always going to talk about. They always point to like coelacanth or the okapi or even the gorilla. They always point to those things to being very unknown cryptids. But it's what's really interesting is like they found a species of orangutan, the taponali, that they recently categorized again as an orangutan in 2017. That's pretty interesting. Or they found grizzly polar bear hybrids in the wild. Or they've seen freakishly large boars, hogzillas. Those are very likely cryptids. So I'm going to start on S tier for cryptids. Cryptids which I think are extremely likely to exist. And almost every one of my cryptids, which I would say extremely likely to exist in the S tier, are things which are either released, invasive, or vagrant. So everybody's watching Tiger King right now, right? So there are more tigers or more giant or megafauna cats in North America than there are in the wild. There are more tigers, more jaguars, more lions, what have you, because they're breeding them in captivity and there's a trade of exotic animals. At the same time, people are seeing alien big cats, which is probably the most seen of any cryptid ever by far. And some of these, by definition, have to be released or even invasive released animals, where they got released and then they bred in the wild. So many people may have had, say, Siberian tigers or even, Southeast Asian tigers that got out in a place like Florida, that there could be breeding populations of tigers in the United States. So alien big cats is released and then actually released to the point where they're able to have a breeding population, they become invasive. I would say that is an extremely likely cryptid. Also, you look at something like phantom kangaroos. People see phantom kangaroos all the time. In reality, there are phantom kangaroo breeding populations in Scotland, in France, and in other places, New Zealand. So if somebody sees a kangaroo, or it's usually wallabies that are becoming invasive and start breeding, they're really becoming invasive species, that there's breeding populations in the wild of wallabies in the northern hemisphere outside of Australia. If somebody sees a kangaroo, you should take that very, very seriously, because they can breed and you should search for them and categorize them. Because phantom kangaroos, sometimes people see phantom kangaroos and they don't chase after it, but the phantom kangaroos are scientifically provable. There are breeding populations which are observed right now. And we're going to talk about a very interesting one, which is the New Zealand moose, or what do they call it? It's in a certain place. It's like a fjord land on the southern island in New Zealand. And they released these moose in like 1910. And people are seeing them all the time to this day. They thought that they just stocked up the island of mooses for hunting. But these moose are breeding in the wild, and we have pictures of them. So that's definitely a very likely cryptid animal. And you were going to go to something else like vagrant species. So supposedly, almost all cougars in the United States are into very small breeding populations or isolated, usually in the Rocky Mountains. But people in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, they say cougar all the time. So at one point, cougar were probably all over the United States. So what's probably happening is cougar are breaking out, moving out of their small isolated populations and rewilding across North America. And the biggest example is Upper Peninsula cougars, but there's probably vagrant cougars which are being reintroduced to their original range throughout the United States right now, as the United States is really becoming much more urbanized, and you have these rural populations which are declining and becoming older, and that they're able to not prevent the respread of wolves and cougars which are previously hunted or pushed out of their once natural habitats. So when we're looking at wolves or cougars, we shouldn't just roll our eyes if we're seeing those in the wild in North America. We should assume that those are vagrant species which are being reintroduced. They're spreading back out into their original range. And a similar example is lake monsters are, just like alien big cats, are almost a universally recognized phenomenon. Something that is completely true is the fact that there are sturgeons, and sturgeons can be very endangered. Well, some of these sturgeons might be coming back into lakes through riverways, and when people are seeing sturgeons, they could be identifying them as lake monsters, because there could be, the rewilding, reintroduction through nature of sturgeons into these lakes, and when people are seeing them and they're not used to them, what they're seeing is lake monsters. And sturgeons could get quite big. And if you're going in and people aren't fishing out such a sturgeon in such a lake and they don't think that they're there, then they're being reintroduced and people are seeing them. Okay, so let's move on to the A tier. These I wouldn't say necessarily exist because all the previous ones in the S tier I actually personally believe in. These are the stuff that I wouldn't be surprised if it existed. And a lot of these are relics or, more fantastic vagrants. So let's start out here. I have Tasmanian tigers. So everybody knows about the Tasmanian tigers, which are like, in between a coyote and a wolf, that are these marsupial predators which existed at one point in Australia and then retreated into Tanzania when humans came, and then they were hunted into extinction. At some point in the 1930s, I think 1936, the last known Tasmanian tiger went extinct. There were, widespread sightings or here and there sightings until the 1970s, and people thought it was likely to exist until the 1970s, and at that point it was declared extinct, but people are seeing them still today. People are seeing them on Australia today, even though they did exist in Australia in the distant past, but by the time Europeans came to Australia, they no longer lived in Australia. I would say obviously in Tasmania they're slightly more likely to be around, but they're not exactly, if they found some in Australia, that wouldn't blow my mind. So that's a relic population of a very recently extinct animal, which could very well still be around. So let's move on. Lake monsters as inland sharks. This has actually been observed, and I think in Minnesota they found a shark tooth in a water processing plant. And bull sharks can live in fresh water, and sometimes there's sharks can somehow adapt into fresh water. Bull sharks will swim up rivers and live in fresh water, but so you could find a shark that somehow, for some freak reason, becomes well adapted. Say a bull shark becomes well adapted to living in fresh water, and it could become trapped in a lake, and that could be a lake monster. And the same thing, and probably slightly more realistic, is seals, like a sea lion. It somehow gets trapped inside of a lake, a vagrant species, and then people are seeing it. People don't know what it is. They're not used to seeing it, and that's a lake monster. That's a very likely lake monster. Or you could have a giant eel as a lake monster. Now, it's probably not that likely that there could be an undiscovered species of eel as lake monsters, but it's possible, and you could have vagrant eels that have somehow adopted into being freshwater. And you can also have, the idea is if that eels are trapped in a limited space and they're not able to breed. And so if the legend is the lindworm, that there's some eels that are stuck in a well and that they're not able to breed. So they end up growing indefinitely inside the well. And that's a pretty famous legend. The idea of this isolated eel becoming an example of giantism, and that could very easily be a lake monster. An isolated eel, which ends up living, because they found eels that have been stuck in wells for like 150 years. So an eel that somehow got stuck in a lake, and it's maybe a vagrant eel somehow that got there, and then it grows to a large size and it becomes a lake monster. Just as a surgeon that could be vagrant and grows into a lake monster. That's pretty likely, actually. So there are giant squids. People didn't believe giant squids didn't exist for a period of time, and they thought they were part of legend. But people, of course, knew about giant squids for almost all of human history, and then there was a small period in the Enlightenment where they actually doubted the existence until they found the corpses of colossal and giant squids. Right? There could be more colossal and giant squid subspecies or other species. They could get bigger than we've observed them if they live for a long enough period. And there could be octopuses, which are just as big or bigger than those giant squids and colossal squids are. An example is the Lusca. The Lusca is a pretty legendary octopus creature in the Caribbean, which is believed to grow to the size of a giant squid. That's actually pretty likely. If people ended up finding a Lusca, I would believe it. While we're on the topic of sea monsters, a sea serpent is a giant sea snake. Pretty likely. If you have an anaconda, which we haven't found, like an anaconda or a Burmese python type sea snake. That could be a sea serpent, pretty likely. And another example is a anaconda. People have observed anacondas; they never caught them, which are like 40 to 50 feet long. That is a cryptid I could see people finding. Maybe we just haven't found it in the Amazon, or there are special giant anacondas or giant Burmese pythons we haven't bumped into yet. That's, I would say, a pretty likely cryptid. Now, the swamp ape, personally, I would say at least for North American ape men is the most likely, but generally ape men are less likely. But I'm going to say if there are released orangutans or other released great apes into a place like the Everglades or certain very wet regions of the southeastern United States, the idea that the skunk ape is actually a released great ape, that's actually pretty possible. And I'm going to touch on alien big cats or phantom cats again. The idea that these are relic species. So there could be a relic of your Asian lynxes in Western Europe, and people are seeing them. It's a phantom big cat, right? That's, technically it's a relic population that was hunted to extinction hundreds of years ago, and it's now being found or seen, and those are alien big cats. But there's also another example. Jaguars used to live inside of the United States, and if somebody saw a jaguar in Arizona, very likely cryptid, right? Very likely to be real. But leopards and lions, at one point in human history, before they're hunted to extinction, as well as cheetahs, had a much larger range, including a range within Europe. So there could be vagrant leopards, vagrant lions, or relic populations of leopards and lions that people are seeing, and perhaps they're adapting to Europe, and their fur is changing. So that's why somebody's seeing something like a black panther. This small black panther is perhaps a leopard, which got stuck up there in Europe, and it turned into a black leopard, right? A black panther. And it's the small inbred relic population or vagrant population which has lived there for hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years. And that's a very likely possibility of what alien big cats could be. Even a tiger, a vagrant species of tiger, which it wasn't, released Tiger King style, if you will, could have walked over into Europe, could have gotten pushed over. There's vagrant species all the time. So a vagrant big cat being an alien big cat, pretty likely. And you're going to go, there are some big cats where they could be relics of extinct. So like extinct European lions, you could somehow bump into them. And we're going into the Australian Queensland tiger. There's been tiger, not Tasmanian tiger, but tigers. They're frequently seen in Australia. So there's tigers all throughout Southeast Asia. Why couldn't tigers have gotten onto Australia? They're very critically endangered, the subspecies or species of Australian tiger. Queensland tiger, I would say, pretty likely. That's a pretty likely cryptid. Keeping on cats, which are definitely in the realm of possibility, is the Maltese tiger. Cats with a grayish, bluish, tigers that is, hue to their fur have been observed in South China for a pretty long period. And of course, there are varieties of white tigers. So why couldn't there be a variety of grayish blue tigers? That's very likely. We don't have one right now. But as soon as albino animals exist, or these rare alleles creating white tigers, which we've now bred in captivity pretty extensively, there are probably some allele we can find which breeds these blue-gray tigers. Okay, and then there's the ahul, a giant bat, and giant bats are often seen throughout Southeast Asia, just as the ahul is. They're seen in the Philippines, and they're seen, through Malaysia and Indonesia. Pretty likely. There are already, those giant fox bats. So the idea of the ahul being this carnivorous giant bat, kind of likely. Or and this is something people see a lot, is pterosaurs in Africa. Why couldn't those pterosaurs be undiscovered large bats? I would put that in the A tier of cryptids. Okay, let's move into B tier cryptids. Cryptids which are not impossible, but rather unlikely. So let's start out here with Siberian mammoth relics. Occasionally in Siberia, people will see mammoths, but it's pretty rare. But it is a cryptid that people will see every now and again. And something like a mammoth, which is, I think died out, technically speaking, people don't realize this, 4,000 years ago, because there were these small populations on the islands, like the Kuril Islands and the Archangel Islands, I think, that lived until like 4,000 or 3,000 years ago, which is pretty interesting. So maybe, we aren't seeing any islands anymore. We've probably found all the islands up there with satellites where they could have been before they died out. I think there was an island off the coast of California. They lived until like 4,000, 3,000 years ago, until recent history, and they always dwarfed down when they lived that high. But maybe we could bump into mammoths, but we aren't seeing enough, and for there to be a big enough population, right? So you would put that into possible, but very unlikely. Same thing with I think it's called the Mapiguari, and that's giant ground sloths in South America. So pretty unlikely. Or finding an alien big cat, which is not a relic of another population, or like a relic of an extinct population. So like a Siberian tiger cat or something like that. That's pretty unlikely for alien big cats, but it's not impossible. But again, markedly unlikely. The idea that alien big cats are this undiscovered species that we haven't categorized for all this time. Because I, as I said a lot of times, I am a big believer in alien big cats. As far as I would say, that to me is the cryptid that's by far the most likely. Alien big cats. And there's some I would say are absolutely likely, and then you move into something like leopards that are living, that have just migrated up, or cheetahs have migrated up into Europe. I'd say pretty likely, but the idea of the undiscovered species of alien big cat, you're going towards not that likely. And here we're starting to hit a very big species of cryptid, a very famous cryptid, Asian ape men, or Asian continent ape men, Eurasian ape men, and they bleed together. So in Tibet and Nepal, Yeti. In Central Asia and Russia, the almas. And in China, the Yeren. I would say, as far as ape men, this area, and we found horses we didn't know were before in Tibet, in all these obscure areas, and you can't necessarily get to Tibet because of the way that the Chinese Communist Party runs everything. And the thing is, like Yerens, I think they're in Yan'an, Yeren is, but I think it's also in non-Tibetan China as well. But it's mostly in Yan'an, to my understanding. The Chinese government considers a Yeren an endangered species, and if you actually tried to kill a Yeren, you would get in trouble. Because the Yeti, the Almas, and the Yeren, by all their respective governments, they're usually described as endangered species, even if they don't have absolute physical proof of them. Everybody knows about this tangential proof, or you find foot tracks and you find this hair and it doesn't get fully processed through a lab, or somebody that's pretty reputable sees Yeren, Yeti, Almas. But unlike Bigfoot, the governments of Central Asia actually take them very seriously, and if you went after and tried to kill them, you'd get in pretty big trouble. And so let's move on, and this is still in the B category. You got Southeast Asian ape men. Southeast Asia may be slightly more likely than the Yeren and the Alamos and the Eurasian ape men. The Southeast Asian ape men, they're living in an area where there already are great apes. You already got orangutans, right down there. So you got the Orangomawas in Malaysia, Orangapendeks in Sumatra, and I can't say it for the love of, I'm going to fuck it up here, Batik Tama Monkey Man in Singapore. And I can't find its name right now, but I know that there were ape men sightings all throughout the Vietnam War. And this is why this is pretty likely. Not only are there great apes which live in the region, but in the 1990s, remember, we found obscure deer and antelope we didn't know about before until the 1990s in Indonesia. Or not Indonesia, Indo-China. So Southeast Asian ape men are pretty decidedly likely. People actually talk a lot about the Orangopendek. Mainstream people will look at the cryptids, at least the romantic cryptids, because the cryptids I've been talking about, the more likely ones, those get swept under the rug, the less romantic cryptids. And we're moving into the romantic cryptids, obviously, here. Of the romantic cryptids, mainstream scientists or the mainstream media will point at the Orangopendek and say that the Sumatran ape man, pretty likely. Or more likely than, say, a 200-foot sea serpent. Okay, so as I said, in pretty densely unpopulated regions of New Zealand, people see moose, and there's probably moose there. Something which may also be there, and may actually be, people are mistaking mooses for them because they know about them, is a relic population of moa. And, moa weren't all as big as, as big as moose. Some were as big as ostriches, and some were as big as emus. So you could have a population of moa which are living in the more rural parts or obscure parts or densely forested parts of New Zealand. That would be a B-level, B-tier cryptid. The final B-tier cryptid is the idea of a tasselworm or a lindworm being a giant salamander. A European equivalent of the giant salamanders of China and Korea and Japan is, at least biome-wise, pretty likely. But, people don't see that many tasselworms, and they don't see those many lineworms. People used to see lineworms in Scandinavia until the 19th century and widely believed them. I would say the most likely possibility for a lindworm would then be giant salamander, similar to the giant salamanders of Japan and China. Okay, now let's get to the C tier. C tier is unlikely in terms of not enough people are seeing these breeding populations, and unlikely because almost everything here, moving on out, isn't a relic, it isn't a vagrant, and a lot of times we're talking about things that are taxonomically novel. And the more and more you get into something that's taxonomically novel, and the higher and higher the novelty of that taxonomy. So as you move into species that hasn't been discovered, unlikely. Genus that hasn't been discovered, more unlikely. Family, very, very unlikely. Order, which hasn't been discovered, extremely unlikely. And finally, class that hasn't been discovered, you're talking fantastically unlikely. And that's the thing with the more romantic cryptids, is that they're either extreme relics, we're talking Jurassic period plesiosaurs, or extremely taxonomically novel, like a whole new order of animals, say like dogmen. The idea of this carnivorous sort of ape man, sort of dog. That's pretty novel taxonomically. That would have to be like its own order. Let's begin with probably the most romantic of the cryptids, the one that people spill the most over, the one that people really, really want to exist, and quite frankly, it's pretty unlikely. Bigfoot or North American ape men. There are no primates outside of humans that have ever been seen in North America, and there's no fossil record of them. And same thing with the yowie, and let's talk about the yowie. No fossil record of primates, no fossil record of hominids outside of humans. So pretty unlikely there. And I probably should have runk the Southeast Asian and Eurasian into C, and then maybe I'd have to kick Bigfoot down to D, because the way that Bigfoot acts, and he doesn't match hominids, right? And he doesn't match great apes. So you get into this problem of taxonomy where Bigfoot appears to be this pretty high up, like a family tier, a tier of a relic of extinct families, such as Danovitis. Because the thing is, Bigfoot and all these ape men, and I'm not trying to really pick fun of Bigfoot really hard right there, but he doesn't act the way that orangutans do. He doesn't act the way, he doesn't look anything like gorillas. But when you're going back into the fossil record of hominids, he doesn't act the same way either. So you have to go back to these pretty obscure primates that are pretty far out there, like Danavis, right? Or people go and do Gigantopithecus, which doesn't fit because Gigantopithecus body is nothing like the observed Bigfoot body. So you're going into these pre-humanoid bipedal apes, that went extinct like 7 years ago in the case of I don't know why everybody likes Gigantopithecus, because maybe it's because they can't say this. Sahelanthropus, which was extinct species of hominid, African ape, which was around 7 million years ago, which was bipedal, and before chimpanzees and humans diverged. That's a more likely version of Bigfoot. But the problem again with Bigfoot and these great apes, they're bigger than humans, and like Lucy was much smaller than humans, right? So you're getting into these problems of taxonomy where you're bumping into things that aren't, because a relic that we haven't seen for 10,000 years, an ice age relic like a moa or a mammoth, that's conceivable. But where you're bumping into something which is taxonomically pretty novel, you're going into outlandish territory, and that's where this starts in cryptids. You're bumping into Bigfoot. And Bigfoot as a supernatural entity makes a lot more sense if you're taking that and you're going to be honest with yourself and you're looking at Bigfoot historically. It makes a lot more sense supernaturally, and if you try to fit it into a natural framework, you're bumping into these problems of taxonomy. And that's this classic problem with cryptozoology, is it ignores how unlikely these are becoming, because when you're bumping into these very romantic things, you're talking about relics, that you're forcing relics, which are, in the case of Bigfoot, if you want to make a relic, 7 million years, or go into the Loch Ness Monster, you're forcing a freshwater plesiosaur relic of like 65 plus million years ago. That is extremely romantic. You're pushing hard romanticism and hard against extremely unlikely things, and you're bumping up against taxonomical chaos, and you're bumping against outlandish relics, and that's where you're starting to bleed into pseudoscience, where you're chasing things like Bigfoot and you're not saying, oh, it's a vagrant, or it's this relic that was around a few thousand years ago and it went extinct. When you're chasing after things of a brand new taxonomy, that they be all unique on their own, I'm saying, like, this isn't outright impossible, but it's very unlikely. But if I'm going to rank North American ape men, I'm going to say I would in escape, like it's not an escaped gibbon or it's not an escaped orangutan. I would say skunk ape, and then I'd move to the classical Bigfoot, the Northwest Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and then grassman. But this is really interesting, and Keel talks about this a lot, and Jacques Vallée talks about this a lot, is you observe things which are impossible more than you observe things that are possible in UFOs and in unknown animals. You're seeing cryptids, which are much less likely, don't make any sense if they're natural animals. People see way more ape men than they see something that definitely could exist. Relic moas, relic mammoths. They're seeing these things which are extremely unlikely more. And that's, if you're going to be serious about cryptozoology, for the most part, these romantic things, people could be seeing them, but if they're seeing them, they're not natural animals. They have to be supernatural animals. Okay, and again, not completely impossible. And this is, as far as the sea animals I made here, this is probably the more possible. The idea of Mokele Mbembe being a weird crocodile or being a weird monitor lizard. It's just this really big, maybe as big as a saltwater crocodile, monitor lizard or something like that with a really long neck. Maybe this even fits in B. But Congo is pretty sparse, so you could bump into something. But the idea of Mokele Mbembe being a relic dinosaur, that's pretty astronomical. And when you're talking about something like Mokele Mbembe's huge. Like, Tasmanian tigers nowhere near as Mokele Mbembe, because Mokele Mbembe has to be at least like 30 feet long. And you're just running into this really hard thing. And it's something with Mokele Mbembe, people have been searching for that for a long time and to come up with nothing. So, and again, let's keep in the seas here. Thunderbird relic. The idea of Thunderbirds being these Ice Age relics. People see Thunderbirds from time to time. Again, not as much as they're seeing Bigfoot, but they're seeing them. But, nobody ever bumps into a Thunderbird nest. There'd have to be a breeding population. Pretty hard. And then a lindworm is somehow a freshwater crocodilian. Like dragons is the four-legged dragons is northern crocodilians. That they're able to survive the winter. So a lindworm is a crocodilian. Put that in C. Or again, because I talked about relics before, and the thunderbird, and I'm talking about dire wolves now, and the giant Ireland otter, the Dubar, I think it's Dubar Chow. These are three relics. The Dubar Chow is a giant otter relic, and the dire wolf is a giant wolf relic, right? And Thunderbird is a giant relic. The problem with these is people are seeing them less. And in the case of the Moa, right, or the case of like people are seeing probably of these giant relics. They're seeing of these Ice Age mammoth relics. You're probably seeing the giant sloth the most, and you're seeing the mammoth the least, and the dire wolf the least. But the mammoth is the most likely. The mammoth and the moa are the most likely because there's the smallest gap. Because the problem with these relics, and you're getting into tens of thousand years, and finally where it gets crazy in a million years, you're having such a big gap that it becomes impossible. But with something like the moa, where it's like a few thousand years, or mammoths that have shrunk down to a dwarf size, and that they're on like an island, like the California mammoths or the mammoths in the Kuril Islands, more likely. But when you're bumping into like meeting animals like a dire wolf or a dubachar, people would be seeing them because they would be people would bump into them because they'd be more aggressive towards people. So again, putting those down to C, and we're gonna move here into D. And as important before, D is essentially not scientifically impossible, but extremely, extremely unlikely, fantastical. And we're talking about dinosaur relics. So Mokele and Bembe is a sauropod. Lake monsters as a plesiosaur, because you're running into hundreds of millions of years of relics, where when you're running into taxonomically at that point, when you've got relics of entire classes, you're saying they're still around. Because a dinosaur would be a class, like a Mammalia or Reptilia, Dinosaura. So there's no more Dinosaura around, and your relicness, you're having a fossil record of, maybe there's some Plesiocean dinosaurs here and there, and they've covered them up. So there's these relics within the very early Plesiocean, possibly, of dinosaurs. But at the most, you're talking 60 million years or 55 million years. The relics, very small relics in the Plesiocean, which may or not being covered up, are being covered up, and you got to have at least 55 years of these relics to exist without anybody bumping into a minimal fossil record. Very, very unlikely. And we're getting into some stuff. So say like classic sea serpents, snakes that are bigger than anacondas, that are seaborne, that are as big as whales. Okay, right there you're talking in like a different family, right? Or an order size animal of taxonomy. Because when you're getting into these really romantic stuff, what makes them so unlikely is the massiveness of how much of a relic they are, or the novelty that they would be taxonomically. And two things that would really, really be outlandish, right, are dogmen and goatmen. Because here we're talking about something which would be an outright new order, right? Maybe a dogman is like a Bigfoot, but it's carnivorous and has a snout. But again, you're talking about an animal which would be a new order, and you're getting into like four-limbed dragons, not as some kind of crocodile or not as some giant salamander. New order, right? Or you're moving into a Mongolian deathworm. New order. And the idea that Mongolian deathworms are like killing people with electricity, like a landlocked great eel, very weird. And relic dinosaurs, just almost impossible. And we're going to finally move into the F tier. And this is outright impossibility. So you got something like a chupacabra. Chupacabra is not seen until the 1990s, right? Everything that's not seen until very recently, if you're going to argue it's natural, That can't be real, right? All these animals, like Bigfoot, people have been seeing Bigfoot for a longer time, so that creates a lot more viability for Bigfoot. And when you move into something beyond Bigfoot, which is a relic like a moa, these exist in the fossil record. People saw them at one point, interacted with them at one point. They could have been in a very small breeding population, something like the red wolf. So, but you're moving out into something people have seen very, very recently. It started very, very recently. No legend of history or anything like that. It just bumps up into the 90s. Supercabra, pretty impossible, right? Supercabra is so obscure of an animal that it would be beyond class. You're moving into like, it's a brand new class. It wouldn't be Mammalia. It would have to be like an alien invasive species at that point, right? Like a giant sea serpent the size of a whale. That's like order level. Supercabra is an F because you're talking about something that isn't a reptile. You're talking about something that isn't a mammal. It would have to be like an invasive alien species, right? And you're moving into the Jersey Devil, right? And of course, like you could say Supercabra and Jersey Devil, they'd have to be supernatural, right? Jersey Devil or a six-limbed dragon, that is not physically possible for a vertebrate to have that type of body structure. There are not six-limbed vertebrates, right? A dragon which has four limbs, so like a wyvern, a dragon which has wings for arms, like a bat or something like that, or a bird, more likely, scientifically speaking, than the classical six-limbed dragon. That's scientifically impossible. And believing that Mothman is a natural organism, you're moving into something which is, again, would be in a class of its own. Maybe even a phylum of its own. The idea of a natural Mothman. So, round out, things that we haven't seen until the 1990s or until the 20th century. Try and making those into cryptids you could explain naturally, impossible. Things which were folklore, more likely. You're going to put that into like C and D. Things that are heavy relics, you're just going to go into D. But things which are taxonomically impossible, or things we haven't seen until the 20th century, automatic F, right? Very taxonomically novel, or extreme relics, D. And you're moving up in the C where you're getting to relics of the Ice Age, or recent extinct things that we're seeing again, or animals that are, vagrants of a different animal. You're moving into the A, into the B. And when you're moving into things like animals that are released and invasive, that's an S. Or obscure vagrants, that's an S. So I hope this was pretty informative. I probably talked over to myself and got myself tongue-tied and did some Freudian slips, but this is Serp Kerp, and I'm known to do that. I apologize for it. If you made it this far, I really hope that I informed you, and have a great day, guys. P.S. If anybody wants me to talk about the likeliness of any other cryptids, or really in-depth video about a cryptid and how likely it is, or the history behind it and how likely it is, I'm pretty open to that. I hope that I got a pretty wide spraying, and this is the majority of cryptids that people are looking into. But as you know, cryptozoology is pretty interesting and obscure, so you're going to bump into things which I didn't know people thought could exist, or a folklore that people are saying that could be a natural phenomenon of an unknown animal. So leave your comments below and I'll respond to them. I'll give you my thoughts in the comments. Anyway, because of how much I talked about the coronavirus and Corona-chan, I need you guys to start doing the bell as well. Because it seems like my videos are getting less and less views because YouTube got pissed at me for talking about Corona so much. So subscribe and click that bell.